November 14th, 1942. The waters, off Guadalcanal. Midnight. USS Washington steamed through pitch-black darkness, her massive 16-inch guns trained forward, her radar operators staring at their scopes with intense concentration. Somewhere ahead in the darkness was a Japanese battleship, the Kirishima, along with an escort of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese were coming to bombard American positions on Guadalcanal and destroy the fragile American foothold on the island. Washington's sister ship, USS South Dakota, had just been knocked out of the fight, her electrical systems damaged by Japanese gunfire, her crew fighting fires and struggling to restore power. The Japanese fleet was closing in for the kill. South Dakota was helpless, dead in the water, illuminated by Japanese searchlights. She was about to be destroyed. And USS Washington was the only thing standing between the Japanese and total victory. What happened next would last exactly 7 minutes. 7 minutes of the most devastating naval gunfire ever recorded. 7 minutes that would destroy a Japanese battleship, save Guadalcanal, and prove that American technology and training had surpassed anything the Japanese could field. But despite this incredible achievement, USS Washington would become the most underrated battleship in American history. Her crew would watch as other ships received the glory and recognition while Washington quietly returned to sea to continue the fight. This is the story of USS Washington, the battleship that won the first battleship duel of the Pacific War, the ship that saved Guadalcanal, the silent killer that the Japanese learned to fear, but that history somehow forgot. This is the story of 7 minutes that changed the course of the war, fired by a ship that never received the recognition it deserved. USS Washington was a North Carolina-class battleship, commissioned in May 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor. She displaced over 35,000 tons and stretched 729 feet from bow to stern. Her main battery consisted of 9 16-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets that could hurl a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell over 20 miles with devastating accuracy. She could make 27 knots at full speed, making her one of the fastest battleships in the world. But what made Washington truly revolutionary wasn't her guns or her speed. It was her radar. Washington was equipped with the latest fire control radar, a technology that allowed her to detect and target enemy ships in complete darkness or through smoke and rain. While Japanese ships relied on optical rangefinders and the naked eye, Washington could see in the dark. This technological advantage would prove decisive in the battles to come. The battleship's commanding officer was Captain Glenn Davis, a no-nonsense officer who drilled his crew relentlessly. Davis understood that the ship's advanced technology was only as good as the men operating it. He ran constant training exercises, practicing night battles and radar tracking until his crew could operate in their sleep. The gunnery officers, fire control teams, and radar operators became so skilled that Washington achieved a level of accuracy that other battleships could only dream of. Washington arrived in the Pacific in mid-1942 and immediately went to work. While other battleships received media attention and glory, Washington quietly performed escort duties, shore bombardment missions, and patrol operations. She wasn't flashy. She didn't seek the spotlight. She just did her job with ruthless efficiency. The crew began to call themselves the Silent Service, a reference to the submarine force because they felt like nobody noticed their contributions. By November 1942, The situation on Guadalcanal had reached a crisis point. American Marines had captured Henderson Field, the island's airstrip, back in August. But the Japanese were determined to retake it. Throughout September and October, the Tokyo Express, fast Japanese destroyer and cruiser forces, ran supplies and reinforcements down the slot to Guadalcanal every night. The Marines held the airfield, but just barely. They were outnumbered, low on supplies, and under constant pressure. The Japanese planned a massive offensive to retake Henderson Field in mid-November. As part of this operation, they would send a powerful surface force to bombard the airfield and destroy American positions. The bombardment force would be built around two fast battleships, Hai and Kirishima. These Kongo-class battleships were among Japan's finest warships, modernized in the 1930s with powerful engines and heavy armament. Each carried 8 14-inch guns and could make over 30 knots. They were formidable opponents. American intelligence detected the Japanese buildup, and Admiral William Halsey, commander of South Pacific Forces, ordered Rear Admiral Willis Lee to intercept the Japanese bombardment force with Task Force 64. Lee's force consisted of just 2 battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers. It wasn't much, but it was all Halsey had available. Lee, a battleship expert and former Olympic rifle shooter, known for his precision and calm under pressure, understood the odds. He would be outnumbered and outgunned. But he had 2 advantages: radar and surprise. Lee positioned his small force in Iron Bottom Sound, the body of water between Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. The sound had earned its grim nickname from the dozens of ships that had been sunk there in previous battles. Now, it would claim more victims. Lee placed his 4 destroyers in the lead, with Washington and South Dakota following behind. He planned to use his destroyers as scouts and torpedo platforms while his battleships hung back, using their radar to target the Japanese from long range. It was a sound plan. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. The night of November 14th to 15th was moonless and overcast. Visibility was near zero. Perfect conditions for Washington's radar advantage, but also terrifying for the sailors, who knew that death could come from any direction without warning. The American force steamed slowly through Iron Bottom Sound, radar operators scanning their scopes for any sign of the Japanese. At 11:17 in the evening, Washington's radar detected the Japanese force entering the sound from the northwest. The contacts appeared on the radar screen like ghosts materializing from the darkness. Admiral Lee counted the blips: 2 large contacts that had to be battleships and multiple smaller contacts that were likely cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese had arrived exactly as intelligence had predicted. Now came the hard part. Lee ordered his destroyers to attack. The 4 American destroyers, heavily outgunned but determined to buy time for the battleships, charged toward the Japanese force and launched their torpedoes. The Japanese, surprised by the sudden attack, returned fire with devastating effect. Within minutes, all 4 American destroyers were hit. USS Walk took a torpedo and exploded, breaking in half and sinking almost immediately. USS Preston was hit by multiple shells and sank. USS Benham had her bow blown off by a torpedo, but managed to limp away. USS Gwin was heavily damaged, but remained afloat. The destroyer attack had thrown the Japanese into confusion, but it had also cost the Americans dearly. Now, it was just Washington and South Dakota against the entire Japanese force. And things were about to get worse. South Dakota, steaming ahead of Washington, suddenly experienced a massive electrical failure. A circuit breaker had tripped, knocking out power to her fire control systems, her radar, and most of her electrical equipment. She was effectively blind and helpless in the middle of a night battle. The Japanese, searching for targets, suddenly spotted South Dakota silhouetted against fires burning on Guadalcanal. Japanese searchlights snapped on, illuminating the battleship in harsh white light. Within seconds, every Japanese ship opened fire on the helpless American battleship. Shells slammed into South Dakota's superstructure, destroying gun directors, radio equipment, and radar antennas. Her crew fought desperately to restore power while under heavy fire. South Dakota was taking a beating and couldn't effectively fight back. But while the Japanese concentrated all their attention and firepower on South Dakota, they made a fatal mistake. They forgot about USS Washington. While the Japanese poured shells into South Dakota, Washington quietly maneuvered into the perfect firing position. Her radar had tracked the entire Japanese force throughout the engagement. Her fire control computers had calculated ranges, bearings, and speeds. Her gun crews had loaded armor-piercing shells and trained their massive 16-inch guns on target. And the Japanese had no idea she was there. Captain Davis, watching the situation unfold from Washington's bridge, made his decision. South Dakota was in trouble and needed help immediately. The only way to save her was to destroy the Japanese ships as quickly and efficiently as possible. Davis gave the order to commence firing. At 23:17, exactly midnight on November 15th, USS Washington opened fire on the Japanese battleship Kirishima at a range of 8,400 yards, less than 5 miles. Point-blank range for a battleship. Washington's first salvo of 9 16-inch shells caught the Japanese completely by surprise. The shells, each weighing over a ton, slammed into Kirishima's superstructure and hull with devastating effect. Before the Japanese could react, Washington fired again, and again, and again. The battleship's gun crews, drilled to perfection by months of training, maintained a rate of fire that was almost unbelievable for weapons of that size. Every 25 seconds, another 9 shells were on their way to the target. The Japanese tried to return fire, but they couldn't see Washington in the darkness. They had no radar to locate her. Their optical rangefinders were useless. They fired blindly in Washington's general direction, but their shells splashed harmlessly into the water hundreds of yards away. Washington, using her radar, hit with almost every salvo. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. For 7 minutes, USS Washington unleashed hell on the Japanese battleship Kirishima. The American battleship fired 75 16-inch shells and over 400 5-inch shells from her secondary battery. The 16-inch armor-piercing shells tore through Kirishima's armor like paper, exploding deep inside the ship and causing catastrophic damage. Fire control systems were destroyed. Gun turrets were knocked offline. The superstructure collapsed. Fires raged out of control throughout the ship. One shell penetrated Kirishima's steering room, destroying the steering gear and leaving the battleship unable to maneuver. Another shell hit below the waterline, opening a massive hole that allowed thousands of tons of seawater to flood into the hull. Multiple shells hit the engine rooms, destroying boilers and reducing the ship's speed to a crawl. Kirishima was being systematically destroyed, and her crew was helpless to stop it. The Japanese crew fought desperately to save their ship. Damage control parties battled fires while under continuous bombardment. Engineers tried to restore power and steering. Gun crews attempted to return fire even as their ship was being torn apart around them. But it was hopeless. Washington's radar-directed fire was simply too accurate. Every salvo hit. Every hit caused severe damage. Within 7 minutes, Kirishima had been reduced to a burning, sinking wreck. At 23:24, just 7 minutes after Washington opened fire, Captain Davis gave the order to cease fire. Kirishima was finished. The Japanese battleship was dead in the water, burning from stem to stern, listing heavily to starboard, and clearly sinking. There was no need to waste ammunition on a ship that was already doomed. Davis ordered Washington to turn her guns on the Japanese cruisers and destroyers that were now desperately trying to escape. But the Japanese escorts had seen enough. They had just watched a battleship that they considered invincible be destroyed in 7 minutes by an enemy they couldn't even see. They wanted no part of Washington's radar-guided guns. The Japanese cruisers and destroyers made smoke and retreated at high speed, abandoning Kirishima to her fate. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was over. The Americans had won a decisive victory. Kirishima burned through the night, her crew abandoning ship as fires reached the magazines and ammunition stores. At around 3 in the morning on November 15th, massive explosions tore through the dying battleship as her magazines detonated. She rolled over and sank in over 3,000 feet of water, taking hundreds of her crew with her. It was a tragic end for a ship that had served the Japanese Navy since 1915 and had been completely modernized in the late 1930s. USS South Dakota, badly damaged but still afloat, limped away from the battle area escorted by Washington. She had taken 42 hits from Japanese shells, but her armor had held, and her casualties were relatively light considering the punishment she had taken. South Dakota would require months of repairs, but she would return to service and continue fighting. Her crew had bought precious time with their sacrifice, allowing Washington to position herself for the killing blow. Washington emerged from the battle with minimal damage. A few near misses had caused some minor flooding, but the battleship was fully operational and ready to continue fighting. Her crew had performed flawlessly under pressure, demonstrating that training and technology could overcome numerical superiority. They had saved Guadalcanal. They had won the first battleship versus battleship duel of the Pacific War. They had sunk a Japanese battleship in record time. And yet, when the news reached the American public, it was South Dakota that received all the attention. The press loved South Dakota's story, the plucky battleship that had fought against overwhelming odds, taken dozens of hits, and survived. Newspapers ran headlines about South Dakota's heroic stand. The crew received medals and recognition. South Dakota became famous. Washington was barely mentioned. The silent killer had done her job too well. Because she had emerged from the battle almost unscathed, the press assumed she hadn't really been in much danger. They didn't understand that Washington's lack of damage was due to her superior performance, not luck. Captain Davis and the crew of Washington didn't complain. They weren't seeking glory. They had done their job. They had saved South Dakota. They had saved Guadalcanal. They had proven the value of radar and superior training. That was enough. But there was a quiet frustration among the crew that their achievement was being overlooked. They had just accomplished something historic, and the world barely noticed. After the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, USS Washington returned to her routine of escort duty, shore bombardment, and patrol operations. She continued to serve with distinction throughout the rest of World War II. But she never again found herself in a battleship versus battleship duel. The fight with Kirishima would remain her finest moment, and it was a moment that history seemed determined to forget. Washington participated in numerous operations across the Pacific. She provided fire support for amphibious landings. She escorted carrier task forces. She bombarded Japanese-held islands. In February 1943, she collided with USS Indiana during nighttime maneuvering, sustaining damage that required repairs. But she was back in action within weeks, ready to continue the fight. The battleship's war record was impressive by any measure. She participated in operations in the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippines. She fired her 16-inch guns in anger dozens of times. She helped protect American carriers from air attack. She provided crucial fire support that saved American lives during amphibious assaults. But none of these achievements captured public imagination the way her 7-minute destruction of Kirishima should have. Part of the problem was timing. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal happened in November 1942, relatively early in the Pacific War when the outcome was still very much in doubt. By the time the full story of the battle could be told without compromising operational security, other battles and other ships had captured the public's attention. Washington's moment in the spotlight had passed before it really began. Another factor was the nature of Washington's victory. It had been too one-sided, too clinical, too much like target practice. The public wanted stories of desperate struggles against overwhelming odds, not stories of technological superiority and superior training, resulting in easy victories. South Dakota's story of taking dozens of hits and surviving was more dramatic and more emotionally satisfying than Washington's story of using radar to destroy an enemy who never saw her coming. The crew of Washington felt this neglect keenly. They had done everything asked of them and more. They had trained harder than other crews. They had maintained their equipment to a higher standard. They had fought brilliantly when called upon. And their reward was to be forgotten while other ships received glory and recognition. It was frustrating and demoralizing, even though they understood the realities of public relations and media coverage. Captain Davis, promoted to Rear Admiral after the battle, defended his crew and his ship for the rest of his life. He never sought personal glory, but he wanted the men who had served under him to receive the recognition they deserved. In interviews after the war, Davis would carefully explain what had happened that night off Guadalcanal. How Washington had saved South Dakota and destroyed Kirishima. How his crew had performed with extraordinary skill and courage. But by then, the war was over, and the public had moved on to other concerns. The Battle of Guadalcanal marked a turning point in the Pacific War. After that night, the Japanese Navy never again attempted a major bombardment mission against Henderson Field. The Marines on Guadalcanal were able to hold their positions and eventually drive the Japanese from the island. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which had hung in the balance for months, turned decisively in favor of the Americans. And USS Washington's 7 minutes of devastating gunfire had made it possible. Washington's destruction of Kirishima also had important tactical implications. It demonstrated that American fire control radar had given the United States Navy a decisive advantage in night battles. The Japanese, who had dominated night fighting in the early months of the war, through superior optics and training, suddenly found themselves at a severe disadvantage. They could no longer rely on darkness to shield them from American gunfire. This realization forced changes in Japanese naval tactics and contributed to their growing sense that the technological balance had shifted against them. USS Washington remained in service after World War II ended. But like most battleships, she was quickly made obsolete by naval aviation and guided missiles. She was decommissioned in June 1947 and placed in reserve. Various plans were proposed to modernize her or convert her to other uses, but none came to fruition. In June 1961, USS Washington was sold for scrap. The battleship that had saved Guadalcanal was cut apart and melted down. It was an ignominious end for a ship that had accomplished so much. Today, USS Washington is remembered primarily by naval historians and World War II enthusiasts. There is no museum ship to visit, no memorial to honor her achievements. A few artifacts survive in museums and private collections. Some photographs and film footage document her service. But for most Americans, USS Washington is just another name in the long list of warships that served during World War II. The silent killer remains silent, her story overshadowed by more famous ships and more dramatic battles. But those who know the full story understand what USS Washington accomplished. On the darkest night of the Guadalcanal campaign, when the fate of the island hung in the balance, when American destroyers had been destroyed and South Dakota was being torn apart by Japanese gunfire, Washington steamed out of the darkness and destroyed an enemy battleship in 7 minutes of the most accurate naval gunfire ever recorded. She saved South Dakota. She saved Guadalcanal. She proved that American technology and training could defeat Japanese skill and determination. USS Washington was the most underrated American battleship of World War II. She never received the recognition she deserved. Her crew never got the glory they earned. But they had the satisfaction of knowing that, when it mattered most, when everything was on the line, they had performed flawlessly. They had done their job. And in the end, that's what truly matters. USS Washington didn't need headlines or monuments. She had the respect of the men who served on her and the grudging admiration of the enemy who faced her guns. That's a legacy worth remembering.